Hi, welcome to Lesson 3 of City Vision University's Introduction to Christian Addiction Counseling. I'm Andrew Sears. In this lesson, we're going to focus on Christian counseling integration model and Christian worldview. And this course, just so you know, if you want to share this with others, you can share it for free. We have a free version of this course on cityvisioninstitute.org. Now, the integration model is particularly helpful for people who are working in secular context and working in the public square. Now, some of the major representatives: Bruce Naramore, Mark McGinn, Stan Jones, Everett Worthington, and some of these are top leaders in their fields, in the fields of psychology. Now, this integration model is the dominant approach at a lot of the Christian graduate schools. So the major orientation. So one is an interdisciplinary integration. So that is kind of more like a meeting of equals. So the goal is to integrate psychology and theology. A lot of people wouldn't call it the meeting of equals, but I would frame it a little more that way. Versus the worldview integration, there the goal is the proper interpretation of modern psychology according to Christian worldview. It's saying we're going to start with Christian worldview and then we're going to interpret psychology. And then the third is the ethical integration, and that's popular among postmoderns. And it's basically just saying, I'm going to try to live Christianly in my personal and professional life. Now, the common slogan that's used in the integration model is all truth is God's truth. And the key insight is that God is glorified whenever Christians make use of his truth. Now, the limitation is the way the slogan is often used seems to imply that all secular psychology is true. This is a huge point. I went to school at MIT. There's a lot of sciences that are sciences, hard sciences, and psychology, in my opinion, is more of a soft science, which means that there's some parts of it that are highly provable, and there's other parts of it that they say are proven in our science and are largely a little more than religion or ethics. And it's important to recognize that just because they put it under this, blanket of psychology doesn't mean that all of it's true. And part of what's interesting is there's a lot of things that psychology, they change what they believe is true, not necessarily based on science, but based on what's popular, within academia at that point, right? So the quality of integration, and we've talked about this before, there's strong integration, and that is where Christian thought makes a real impact. And these are some of the examples in this field that do strong integration. And then there's weak integration, and Christianity makes no substantial impact. And there's a lot of people, the point is, a lot of people will use the term integration. And the reality is there's some where they are really being very thoughtful. It is a biblical worldview, and they're making sure that is throughout everything they do. And then there's others, they just call it integration, and really they're using secular psychology and counseling. Now, the strength of the integration model is a lot of the strongest people in science can still use this. You can get published research. It allows the Christian faith to interpret psychology. It recognizes the role of God's creation grace, or some people call it common grace, in culture and science that God uses, and it seeks to engage the culture and impact contemporary psychology. So you're operating and trying to engage in the public square in psychology, publishing in common journals. Now, some of the weaknesses, it assumes a dualistic separation between biblical research and research on human beings. So that would be, difference between research in the theology domain and research in psychology. And it also assumes that modern psychology is the real legitimate version of psychology. And basically it says, we're going to follow, the my house, my rules. We're going to follow all the rules of psychology as if all those rules are okay, and there's not any sort of issues with any of those rules. So it allows secularism to set the agenda for psychology, and it minimizes the distorting effects of sin on our understanding. It basically is saying that even psychologists get, their views are going to be distorted. And ultimately, by doing poor or weak integration, it undermines the lordship of Christ and the impact of redemption, especially in counseling. So, as we had talked about before, we have these different range of integration among models, and these models are going to have some integration between counseling and psychology. Now, transformational counseling, Christian counseling, and the integration model. So we're talking about integration model. All of these, what's tricky is in the book, it uses the term integration model. That's its own model. But then there's this other thing where there's some integration between the whole field. And all of these have some integration, even though they're not following the integration model. So that hopefully that's not too confusing for you. But transformational counseling will integrate some ideas from secular from psychology, and same thing with Christian psychology. And biblical counseling, progressive biblical counselors will allow for small amounts of or lesser amounts of integration. And you have these domains out here where it's all Bible, no science, and then over here all science, no Bible. That where there's no integration. And so let's talk a little bit about worldview. So we've talked a lot about worldview so far. We haven't really defined that. We have a video this week that talks about that. But the Christian worldview, the base worldview is called Christian worldview. The secular worldview is called secular scientific naturalism. Basically what that means is secular means there's no God, is the assumption that they're building into. Naturalism is what you see in nature is all you get. Only things that you can measure are things that are real. It denies, the truth. I think it was Einstein that said all the things that count can't be counted, and all the things that can't be counted often don't count. So it completely ignores that, right? What's the fundamental problem? So in the Christian worldview, now what a worldview is it answers these huge meta questions in life. So the Christian worldview says that the fundamental problem is sin, whereas secular counseling says the problem is a psychological problem. The solution is salvation. Secular counseling says the solution is counseling. And who are we in God's image but fallen? And secular counseling just says we're basically animals. We're basically collections of atoms, and we're thinking animals. Where did we come from? We came from God. And secular counseling says accidental cosmic chance. Now, what's important to recognize about this, these are assumptions. These are not things that are provable. There's no one who is living back whenever the universe was created. So on the secular side, they try to say that this is all based on science, but the whole worldview is creating assumptions. Science can't prove there isn't a God. It's creating a lot of assumptions. Now, philosophy, spiritual and holistic. Philosophy, materialistic, reductionistic. So all that matters is the physical, and then the reductionistic is you break things up into tiny parts and you keep breaking them up rather than being, it's kind of opposed to holistic. The values are Bible based, and then in secular counseling, it pretends falsely to be value free, which isn't, true, right? How should we live? Ultimately, the Christian worldview says, we're supposed to live like Jesus, and he summarized that, love God, love others. Secular counseling basically says what we're really trying to get you to do is to maximize your pleasure individually or to self-actualize. So all these meta questions, these big picture questions, really, it's kind of like, if you had a master kit that's going to define how all your Legos are going to fit together. It's the thing that assembles, all the pieces. And that's what worldview is it's something that's basically saying, okay, this is the blueprint. This is how all the pieces are supposed to fit together. And a lot of these things are just assumptions. And ultimately, they're assumptions. Someone who went to MIT, the reason why they make these assumptions is because it's convenient. You want to be able to solve a problem. So you say, we're only going to do what's measurable. You want it to be, definable. So you say, we're only going to look at the material. That doesn't mean that that's true. It just simplifies the approach to the problem. So one thing to think about this, so recognizing this Christian worldview and recognizing the secular worldview, The question is, how strong is the Christian worldview in your integration? So how much are you emphasizing these things? Whenever you talk about what's the problem, what's the solution, who are we, where we came from, how much is that coming through in your counseling versus you have all these built-in assumptions to the model if you're trained, secularly. And the point that I made in an earlier lecture is that you can be Christian integration and you can have deep integration. So that might be, you have a strong lens that's informing this. And then Christian psychology or transformational counseling or even biblical counseling, just because someone says they use the Bible doesn't mean that they're actually following a Christian worldview. Because they may be misinterpreting the Bible, they may not even know the Bible. So what's important is to recognize that there's weak Christian worldview and a strong Christian worldview. Now, another example of how to think about this is, people have used the term, Christmas tree integration. So where the idea is you take a Christmas tree, secular whole, concept, and you're just going to put one Christian ornament on it. And then you're going to say, this is, Christian integration. You're going to, pray before you do something, or you're going to put a Bible verse, and then all of a sudden that makes it Christian. Now, ultimately what you're trying to do, so I showed the 4 quadrants before, and the idea is that Christian worldview is that all disciplines should be interpreted through this lens of a Christian worldview. So, you have this cross, and you have principles from humanities, truths from sciences, learning from cultural studies, lessons from social sciences. And you're going to have a filter, and there's going to be some things that's going to come out of this that's going to be incompatible with the Bible. Now, I'm not talking about, where we said that the earth revolves around the sun. I'm talking about there's a lot of things that call themselves sciences that aren't science, that are approximations of science, are rough. There's parts of it that are science and parts of it that aren't. So part of it, and even with that, it's a question of how do all the pieces fit together. A scientist can't prove that the only way we should view ourselves is as a collection of atoms, or they can't really prove that the only way we should view ourselves is that we're just intelligent animals. What that does is that makes us less sacred, makes us value life less sacredly. So those are things that come from a worldview. So, we talked before about what we're trying to do is to have this balanced diet of these 5 perspectives, because you don't know where you're going to go. Now, ultimately, the problem is most people, this is how many Christians are trained in counseling. They get secular training in counseling, and they might read one book. So they get one book in Christian integration, and then they go to church on Sundays. But the reality is they only have one food group. A lot of people don't even have that food group. They never read a book on Christian integration. They don't even recognize that Christian integration by itself is an entire field, like psychology or like theology. There's entire departments that are focused on this. And ultimately, because they're only using the secular tool, they end up, like this guy who is only trained in the secular worldview. He has one big, muscle that he's been using that, and ultimately you have to get trained in this other worldview. And that's ultimately the reason why some people say all integration is harmful, I think, is there's a cultural tendency of any dominant culture. So, for example, secular counseling is to assimilate. And so most Christian integration results in the secular counseling worldview dominating. So many have seen, and I've seen this happen. I've seen friends who lose their faith by going into the field of counseling. We have you read some articles that are about that. The field of counseling and social work has the highest rate of secularization. That's an assimilation process. That's not a healthy process. Counselors say that cultural assimilation is bad, except whenever they're doing it to you and they're trying to, assimilate you to the to their worldview. And ultimately, what happens is assimilation happens through dominant worldview and training materials, through relationships with others in the field, through funding sources. Unless you're secular, you can't get funding, through government policies, through insurance policies. And, the reason why some people say that all integration is harmful is it's like some people who say, should you drink a little alcohol? A lot of people have said that you shouldn't drink at all. And, the reason for that is it becomes a problem with people who just start drinking a little, so it's better avoided. So this isn't just, paranoid people who think this. The majority of people who go into counseling, I think I saw the stats, like 60% of students lose their faith. That's pretty brutal, If that were happening on cultural terms, across ethnicities, that would be a much bigger deal, but it's happening across religious terms. So the other issue is developing a strong integration perspective where Christian worldview is dominant. Honestly, it takes a lot of study and effort. Most people don't want to do that much work. So being a strong Christian and learning in secular counseling, I showed you the example of the guy who had the really strong right arm. Well, you're going to have to exercise that left arm. And it's not just taking theology courses. It's studying the integration, the field, how the two relate. There's tons of people who've thought very deeply about, okay, here are the domains where the field of psychology is violating biblical values and studying that. So, and ultimately that's what good faculty in Christian counseling programs spend their lifetime studying. So that's a whole field. And there's a long history of Christian organizations being assimilated and secularizing through mission creep, worldview creep. Former Christian colleges, Harvard is an example, the YMCA. There's a lot of rescue missions that have, secularized. And one of the driving factors is the vast majority of counseling funding requires a secular worldview and following secular guidelines. So many organizations chase the funding and lose their original core mission. These are all significant things to be very concerned about. And that's why a lot of people have this attitude, and they say no integration, just like someone says, not a drop of alcohol in my house. Now, there's a challenge about that because there's a lot of good. And unlike, alcohol that, you could say there's often more harm than good, there's a lot of good. So it'd be more like saying, can be comparable to saying no medicine. That has a bigger consequence, right? So what is different about Christian education at City Vision? So we have these courses. So this course that you're taking, Introduction to Christian Addiction Counseling, is doing deep worldview integration. So strong worldview integration, spirituality and addiction. Part of what we're trying to do is redeem the 12-step model. There's a lot of people who've thrown out the 12-step model and said, oh, it's secularized. Well, the whole thing was started by Christians. It was deeply Christian. And in some contexts, it is very secularized. In some contexts, it isn't. So our drugs of abuse, we use a lot of science, but we have also very significant biblical caution on drug use that isn't as common in secular spaces. A lot of secular spaces will say, oh, if you want to smoke some weed, go ahead and, smoke some marijuana, which is not where, Christians generally fall. So counseling in urban and multicultural environments, we have a deep understanding of cross-cultural ministry, technology, life balance, and behavioral addictions. Christian understanding of behavioral addiction, is pornography addiction okay? No. Already, some secular sources will try to say that's not even a thing because they like to have their pornography, right? So, and then family issues and recovery. We have a Christian worldview of family and development, sexual issues and addiction. Same thing with sexual addiction. There's a lot of secular sources. These are not mainstream. Most mainstream secular sources say sexual addiction is a thing. But there are secular sources that try to argue that it's not a thing because in many cases, there's people who are sexually addicted and they want to retain their addiction. Group counseling practices, there's secular groups, but also we support Christian groups, mental illness, addiction, dual diagnosis, a Christian understanding of diagnosis and medication. So, not just saying on one side, no science, and not saying on the other side, no Christian understanding, right? So counseling alcoholics, 12 steps in Christian and secular context, chaplaincy in Christian and secular context, vocation, calling, and purpose of work, Christian understanding of vocation, managing residential recoveries. It's designed for Christian ministries. So all these things, why is this important? It's to help you further solidify your own faith and recovery process if you're in recovery. We want you to deepen your understanding, because what often happens, and this is the thing, this is why I'm so passionate about this. I've seen so many people, they go into recovery, they embrace God, they become a Christian, and then they decide there's this dichotomy between these two worldviews, and they say, well, I have to be a counselor, and I must give up my faith because I have to be a counselor. And this integration is really important because it's going to be critical for you to be able to retain your faith in many ways. So you have to prepare you to have a strong Christian faith and worldview if you're going to work in secular context. To help you develop deep integration of Christian worldview into your understanding of counseling, whether or not if you work in a Christian context or you work with Christian clients or in a secular context. So regardless of where you work, part of what we're trying to do, this is like you're taking a nutrition course. We're trying to say, here's the food groups. We want you to eat healthy for the rest of your life. You need to be continuing to study in those areas to deepen your understanding of how, your Christian faith relates to counseling for the rest of your life, to help you stay current in the rapidly changing field while applying biblical wisdom. The whole field of drugs of abuse has changed dramatically over the past, 10 or 15 years with just the drugs that are being taken, but also our understanding of, how to get people free, and to give you tools to make critical decisions if you become a leader in your profession. So program design, training programs, what's your referral strategy, what's going to be your policy on medications. All these things are going to be really important if you become a leader. So, if you have any questions, please ask your faculty members, and I would encourage you to share the free version of this course with others. It's at cityvisioninstitute.org, and thank you.